But the story does not end there, because once Professor James Walker's ideas began spreading beyond universities and financial circles, something unexpected happened. Ordinary people started sharing their own experiences publicly, not polished success stories, not motivational speeches. Real stories, stories of working 40 years and still being unable to retire, stories of parents losing homes after medical emergencies, stories of graduates buried under debt before their careers even began, stories of people who followed every rule they were told would guarantee stability only to discover stability itself had become a luxury. Across online forums, comment sections, podcasts, and interviews, one emotional pattern appeared again and again: exhaustion, not laziness. Not irresponsibility, exhaustion. Many people no longer felt like participants in the economy. They felt trapped inside it, working harder every year just to maintain the same standard of living their parents achieved more easily decades earlier. And when Walker saw these reactions, he said something that shocked even his supporters. He claimed modern economies are increasingly creating what he called the illusion of upward mobility. In simple terms, people are encouraged to believe they are constantly one breakthrough away from wealth, even when statistically, the system makes that breakthrough incredibly rare. This illusion matters more than most people realize, because hope keeps systems stable. As long as people believe they can eventually make it, they continue participating, consuming, borrowing, and working inside the structure. But what happens when belief starts collapsing? That question is becoming deeply important around the world, especially as younger generations begin openly rejecting traditional definitions of success. For decades, owning a home symbolized stability. A good job meant security. Retirement represented peace after years of hard work. But now, many young adults look at those goals and feel something closer to disbelief than motivation. In major cities across the world, housing prices have risen so dramatically that average workers feel permanently locked out of ownership. Rent consumes massive portions of income. Wages struggle to keep pace with inflation, and entire industries increasingly rely on temporary contracts instead of stable careers. Walker believes this shift is creating a dangerous emotional disconnect between effort and reward. And historically, societies become unstable when people stop believing effort leads to progress. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Walker's analysis is how he connects economics with psychology, because according to him, financial systems don't only shape wallets, they shape identity. Think about how society treats wealthy people compared to struggling people. Success is often viewed as proof of intelligence, discipline, and value. Poverty, meanwhile, is frequently treated as evidence of poor choices or lack of ambition. Over time, people internalize these judgments. Someone struggling financially may begin seeing themselves as a failure, even if external forces played enormous roles in their situation. Walker argues this psychological burden is one of the cruelest parts of economic inequality, because people are not only fighting financial hardship, they are fighting shame. And shame is powerful. It silences people. It isolates people. It prevents honest conversations. Many families hide financial struggles from friends, relatives, even spouses. Parents silently panic about bills while pretending everything is normal for their children. Workers smile during the day while secretly terrified of losing jobs they desperately depend on. Walker says this hidden emotional pressure explains why financial stress has become linked to rising anxiety, depression, burnout, and even declining physical health. Money affects sleep, relationships, confidence, decision-making, and ultimately, quality of life itself. Yet despite how deeply finances shape human existence, many education systems still teach almost nothing practical about money management. Debt structures, investing, taxes, or ownership. Walker considers this one of society's greatest contradictions. People are expected to navigate incredibly complex financial systems without proper preparation. And when they fail, they are often blamed individually instead of questioning why the system remains so difficult to navigate in the first place. This criticism became even more controversial when Walker began discussing the role of financial institutions themselves. Because according to him, Banks and investment firms fundamentally operate as businesses first, not charities. Their priority is profitability. And profitable clients are usually wealthy clients. This means premium financial services naturally flow toward people who already possess assets. Private banking divisions offer personalized strategies, exclusive opportunities, and lower fees for high net worth individuals. Meanwhile, ordinary customers often face overdraft charges, higher interest rates, and limited access to advanced financial tools. Walker once described it with a sentence that spread rapidly online: "The poor pay more for money than the rich." At first glance, that statement sounds impossible. But then you look closer. A wealthy investor borrows millions at low rates to buy appreciating assets. A struggling worker borrows a few $1,000s at crushing interest rates simply to survive emergencies. One debt creates wealth. The other debt destroys stability. And suddenly, the system looks very different. This is why Walker repeatedly emphasizes the difference between productive debt and survival debt. The wealthy often use debt strategically. Businesses use leverage to expand. Investors borrow against assets that increase in value, but ordinary people frequently use debt defensively. Medical bills, food, rent, education, unexpected crises. Debt stops becoming a tool and becomes a lifeline, and lifelines are expensive. The consequences ripple across generations. Children raised in financially unstable households often experience chronic stress earlier in life. Educational opportunities become limited. Career risks feel dangerous instead of exciting. Emergency savings remain difficult to build. Meanwhile, wealthier families can absorb setbacks without complete collapse. A failed business venture becomes a lesson instead of a disaster. An unpaid internship becomes possible because parents provide support. A career change becomes less terrifying because financial cushions exist. Walker says this invisible safety net is one of the most underestimated advantages in modern society, because risk and opportunity are deeply connected. People who can afford risk often gain access to larger rewards. And people trapped in survival mode often avoid risk entirely, because failure carries devastating consequences. This creates what Walker calls economic paralysis, the inability to pursue long-term opportunity because short-term survival dominates every decision. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the housing market. For generations, homeownership represented one of the primary ways ordinary families built wealth. Property values increased over time. Mortgage payments eventually replaced rent. Families accumulated equity and passed it down to children. But today, many younger adults cannot even enter the market. Down payments feel impossible. Interest rates fluctuate unpredictably. Investors purchase massive amounts of property. Rent continues climbing. Walker warns that when ownership becomes concentrated among fewer groups, wealth inequality accelerates dramatically, because owners gain from appreciation while renters remain trapped paying into systems they never benefit from directly. And this dynamic extends beyond housing. Ownership matters everywhere: businesses, stocks, technology, land, intellectual property. The people who own systems often benefit more than the people who operate inside them. That reality may sound obvious, but its consequences are enormous, especially in an economy increasingly driven by automation and artificial intelligence. Walker believes the rise of AI could intensify wealth concentration faster than many governments are prepared for. Why? Because technology scales ownership. A single platform can generate billions while employing relatively few people compared to older industries. Productivity increases massively, but the financial gains often flow primarily toward shareholders and executives rather than workers. If this trend continues, Walker warns society may face an even larger divide between asset owners and labor earners. And this fear is already shaping political debates worldwide. Questions about universal basic income, wealth taxes, housing reform, and corporate regulation are becoming more intense every year. But Walker remains cautious about simplistic solutions because, according to him, economic systems are deeply interconnected. Quick fixes often create unintended consequences. Real reform requires understanding incentives, power structures, and human behavior simultaneously. Still, he insists ignoring inequality entirely is far more dangerous, because history repeatedly shows what happens when populations lose faith in economic fairness, social trust collapses, polarization rises. Anger spreads and institutions lose legitimacy. Walker frequently references historical moments where extreme wealth concentration preceded periods of unrest and instability, not because inequality automatically causes collapse, but because hopelessness eventually transforms into frustration, and frustration demands answers. This is why Walker's lectures often feel less like economics classes and more like warnings. Not warnings about money alone, warnings about society itself, because underneath every economic statistic are human beings trying to build meaningful lives. A father working overtime to pay rent, a mother choosing between groceries and medication, a student wondering if education will ever justify the debt, a young couple delaying children because they cannot afford security. These are not abstract numbers. They are real lives shaped by systems larger than themselves. And Walker believes societies become morally unstable when ordinary people lose access to dignity through work. That sentence resonates deeply because work has always represented more than income. It represents identity, purpose, contribution, belonging. But when full-time workers still cannot achieve basic stability, something fundamental begins breaking psychologically. People stop dreaming long-term. They become cynical, detached, emotionally exhausted. And perhaps that emotional exhaustion explains why so many people connected with Walker's message so intensely. Because he articulated something millions quietly felt but struggled to describe. The sense that modern financial life increasingly resembles a treadmill that speeds up faster every year. No matter how hard people run, many feel they remain in the same place. Yet Walker also warns against falling into complete hopelessness. He says one of the greatest dangers is allowing systemic problems to convince individuals that personal choices no longer matter at all. Because while systems influence outcomes, decisions still shape possibilities, financial literacy still matters, discipline still matters, ownership still matters, community still matters. Walker encourages people to stop viewing wealth purely as luxury consumption and begin viewing it as resilience, emergency savings skills, healthy relationships, long-term thinking, reduced dependence on unstable systems. These forms of resilience may not create billionaire lifestyles, but they create something many people desperately need: breathing room. And according to Walker, breathing room changes human behavior dramatically. When people are less financially desperate, they make better decisions. They think more clearly. They plan further ahead. Stress decreases. Creativity increases. In other words, financial stability creates psychological freedom, and psychological freedom creates opportunity. But the challenge is that millions are struggling to reach even that first layer of stability. This is why Walker argues that conversations about wealth must become more honest, not to encourage resentment, not to demonize success, but to recognize reality clearly enough to improve it intelligently. Because pretending everyone operates under identical conditions only deepens misunderstanding, and misunderstanding creates division. In one memorable interview, Walker was asked a direct question: if the system is so unequal, why don't more people revolt against it? Walker paused for several seconds before answering. Because most people are not asking to become billionaires, he said. They are asking for dignity, stability, and a future they can believe in. That answer spread across the internet within hours because it captured something essential. Most people are not chasing private jets. They are chasing peace of mind, a safe home, health care, time with family, the ability to survive emergencies without collapse, the ability to grow older without terror. And perhaps that is the emotional core of this entire conversation: the fear that these basic forms of security are slowly drifting out of reach for millions of ordinary people. As Professor James Walker's influence continued growing, some financial institutions quietly adjusted their messaging. More banks began promoting financial literacy campaigns. Companies spoke more openly about inequality and economic stress. Governments introduced debates about affordability and cost of living crises. Whether these changes came from genuine concern or public pressure remains unclear. But one thing became impossible to deny. The conversation had shifted. People were no longer discussing wealth only as aspiration. They were discussing it as power, as access, as protection, as survival, and perhaps most importantly, as a system that does not affect everyone equally. Walker never claimed success was impossible for ordinary people. What he claimed was more unsettling, that the race itself is uneven. And once society admits that reality, honestly, difficult questions emerge. How much inequality is sustainable? What happens when younger generations lose faith in the future? Can economies remain stable if ownership becomes increasingly concentrated? And who ultimately benefits from keeping financial systems so complicated that ordinary people struggle to understand them? These questions remain unanswered, but they are growing louder, because behind the statistics, the market reports, and the political debates, there is a deeper human truth unfolding. People do not only want money, they want security, they want fairness, they want hope, and when hope begins disappearing, even the strongest economies become fragile. That may be the most important lesson Professor James Walker leaves behind, not simply that wealth management favors the rich, but that societies themselves become vulnerable when too many people feel permanently excluded from stability. Because history shows something again and again, no system survives forever on inequality alone. Eventually, people demand change. The only question is whether that change arrives through wisdom or through crisis. And right now, the world seems dangerously close to finding out. As the debate around Professor James Walker intensified, another uncomfortable reality began surfacing beneath the headlines. The people defending the system most aggressively were often the people benefiting from it the most. Television panels filled with wealthy investors dismissed growing public frustration as negative thinking. Influencers uploaded motivational videos insisting that anyone struggling financially simply lacked discipline. Corporate executives spoke confidently about opportunity while earning more in a week than many workers earned in years. And slowly, a dangerous divide began forming between economic language and lived reality, because for millions of ordinary people, the crisis was no longer theoretical. It was personal bottom skipping meals so children could eat properly. Workers driving for delivery apps after full-time jobs just to pay bills. Young graduates moving back into childhood bedrooms because rent had become unaffordable. Middle-class families watching savings disappear under inflation. These were not isolated stories anymore. They were becoming normal. Walker believed this normalization of financial strain was one of the clearest warning signs of systemic imbalance. When instability becomes routine, people adapt emotionally in ways that can permanently reshape society. Dreams shrink, expectations lower. People stop planning futures and begin managing survival. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is how quietly this transformation happens. There is no dramatic announcement, no official moment where society admits things are breaking. Instead, exhaustion spreads silently. People laugh less. Stress becomes constant background noise. Relationships suffer. Communities weaken. And individuals slowly internalize the belief that struggling endlessly is simply part of adulthood. Walker often said modern economies have become experts at making dysfunction feel normal. That sentence stayed with many people because once they heard it, they started noticing it everywhere. Workers answering emails during vacations because they fear losing jobs, decrents apologizing for being unable to afford basic experiences for children. People celebrating being busy while mentally collapsing from burnout. Entire industries built around helping exhausted people cope with exhaustion created by the same economic systems consuming their lives. Coffee to stay awake, entertainment to escape stress, shopping to feel temporary happiness, social media to numb insecurity, then back to work again. The cycle repeats endlessly. Walker described this as economic emotional management, a system where people are constantly treated for symptoms while the deeper causes remain untouched. And yet, despite all this pressure, society still glorifies extreme wealth more than ever before. Luxury culture dominates entertainment. Billionaires are treated like celebrities. Success stories focus on private jets, mansions, and massive fortunes, while rarely examining the structures that made such wealth possible in the first place. Walker warned that this obsession with visible wealth creates psychological distortion. People begin measuring human worth through income and status, rather than character, contribution, or integrity. And when societies start worshiping wealth blindly, inequality becomes easier to justify, because the wealthy are no longer simply fortunate or successful. They become viewed as inherently superior, more intelligent, more deserving, more valuable. That belief, Walker argued, is incredibly dangerous because it allows societies to ignore suffering more easily. If struggling people are assumed to deserve their struggles, then inequality no longer feels like a collective problem. It feels like individual failure. And once that mindset spreads widely enough, empathy itself begins eroding. Walker believed this is why economic conversations often become emotionally hostile so quickly. People defending the system hear criticism as jealousy. People suffering inside the system hear success stories as insults. Both sides stop listening to each other. Polarization deepens, and meaningful solutions become harder to reach. But Walker's most chilling observations were about the future, because according to him, many of the pressures people are experiencing today may only represent the beginning, continues, replacing jobs once considered secure. Artificial intelligence is accelerating productivity faster than labor systems can adapt. Housing markets remain increasingly concentrated in investment hands. Healthcare costs continue rising in many countries. Education grows more expensive, and climate-related disruptions threaten food, insurance, infrastructure, and migration patterns globally. Walker warned that when multiple economic pressures collide simultaneously, societies can enter periods of prolonged instability that fundamentally alter social structures, not overnight, gradually. At first, people simply feel more stressed. Then they delay major life decisions. Then institutions lose trust. Then political anger rises. Then extreme solutions become attractive. History has seen this pattern before. And according to Walker, ignoring early warning signs has always been humanity's favorite mistake. Still, despite the darkness of his analysis, Walker repeatedly refused to frame ordinary people as powerless victims. In fact, he strongly criticized hopelessness itself. Because hopeless populations become easier to manipulate, fearful people accept exploitation more easily, exhausted people stop questioning systems, distracted people stop organizing collectively. Walker believed awareness was the first defense against this, not panic, awareness. Understanding how financial systems operate changes how people interact with them. It helps individuals recognize traps disguised as opportunity. It encourages long-term thinking in cultures addicted to instant gratification. Walker encouraged audiences to ask different questions than society normally teaches them to ask. Instead of asking, "How can I look wealthy?" ask, "How can I become financially resilient?" Instead of asking, "What impresses people?" ask, "What gives me stability and freedom?" Instead of chasing appearances, Walker urged people to focus on ownership, education, adaptability, and emotional discipline, because according to him, emotional decision-making fuels enormous amounts of financial destruction, panic investing, impulse spending, lifestyle inflation to Todessy competition. Fear-driven debt. Modern economies, Walker argued, constantly stimulate emotional insecurity because insecure people consume more. That realization disturbed many listeners deeply because once they looked around, they saw evidence everywhere. Advertising rarely sells products alone. It sells identity, Todessy, attractiveness, belonging, doxecit, fear of being left behind. Entire industries depend on convincing people they are incomplete without constant consumption. And social media intensified this pressure to unprecedented levels. For the first time in human history, billions of people compare their daily lives against carefully edited highlights from strangers across the world every single day. Walker believed this creates psychological conditions humans were never designed to handle: constant comparison, constant stimulation, constant inadequacy, and beneath it all, constant financial pressure. Yet despite these enormous systemic forces, Walker still believed individual awareness could create meaningful change over time. He pointed toward communities creating alternative support systems, families teaching financial literacy to younger generations earlier than schools do, workers negotiating more aggressively for fair wages, people becoming more conscious about debt and consumer habits, small shifts, slow shifts, but important shifts. Walker often reminded audiences that systems appear permanent until suddenly they are not. History is filled with economic structures once considered untouchable that eventually transformed under pressure: feudalism, industrial labor systems, colonial trade empires, financial regulations after major depressions. Change always seemed impossible until reality forced adaptation. And according to Walker, modern economies may be approaching another one of those moments. A moment where societies must decide what economic success truly means. Is success measured only by stock market growth, while ordinary people struggle emotionally and financially? Is productivity meaningful if millions remain chronically insecure? Can societies remain healthy if younger generations increasingly believe stability is unattainable? These are not abstract academic questions anymore. They are becoming deeply personal, political, and emotional questions across the world. And perhaps that explains why Professor James Walker became such a polarizing figure, because he challenged something bigger than financial systems. He challenged the stories societies tell themselves about fairness, the belief that markets naturally reward effort perfectly, the belief that wealth always reflects merit, the belief that struggling people simply failed individually. Walker never claimed effort was meaningless, but he insisted effort alone does not explain modern economic outcomes. Access matters, timing matters, education matters, networks matter, geography matters, inheritance matters, luck matters, and pretending otherwise only blinds people to reality. One of Walker's final interviews became especially famous because of a question asked near the end. The interviewer leaned forward and asked quietly, "So what happens next?" Walker remained silent for a moment before answering. "What happens next," he said, "depends on whether societies choose awareness before crisis forces awareness upon them." That line spread across the internet within hours, because it sounded less like a prediction and more like a warning. Today, millions of people continue debating his ideas. Some believe he exposed truths hidden beneath modern financial culture. Others believe he exaggerated inequality and underestimated personal responsibility. But regardless of opinion, one thing is undeniable. The conversation he started is no longer going away, because people can feel something shifting around them: the rising cost of living, the instability, the burnout, the fear, the growing sense that economic systems increasingly reward ownership over labor, capital over effort, and scale over humanity. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: many people still blame themselves entirely for struggles shaped by forces far beyond individual control. They work harder, sleep less, push themselves further, and silently wonder why stability still feels impossible to reach. Walker believed this quiet self-blame was one of the greatest tragedies of modern economic life, because exhausted people often assume they are failing personally, while never realizing how unequal the structure itself has become. And maybe that is the real power of his message: not anger, not resentment, clarity. The clarity to separate personal responsibility from systemic reality, the clarity to recognize manipulation disguised as motivation, the clarity to understand that financial survival and financial freedom are two very different games. And most importantly, the clarity to stop measuring human worth purely through economic success. Because in the end, economies are supposed to serve human beings, not the other way around. Yet somewhere along the way, many societies began treating people like fuel for systems designed primarily around endless growth, endless productivity, and endless consumption. Professor James Walker spent years warning that this imbalance carries consequences far beyond money. It affects mental health, relationships, communities, trust, democracy itself, because when too many people lose faith that the future can improve through honest effort, societies enter dangerous territory. And right now, across much of the world, that faith appears to be weakening, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The real question is no longer whether inequality exists. The real question is how long modern societies can continue functioning while millions feel increasingly excluded from stability, ownership, and hope itself. Perhaps wealth management was only the symptom. Perhaps the deeper issue is that entire economic systems are gradually concentrating security into fewer and fewer hands. And if that trend continues unchecked, the consequences may reshape the future in ways far greater than financial markets alone. Because history teaches one brutal lesson again and again. A society can survive poverty. A society can survive recession. But eventually, no society survives permanently when too many people stop believing the system was built for them at all.